If you've ever searched for budget-friendly ground beef dinners online, you already know what you're going to find. The same tacos, the same spaghetti, the same casseroles with ingredient lists longer than your grocery receipt. And most of those recipes are written as if you've never cooked a meal in your life, which, after decades of feeding families and putting dinner on the table, can feel a little insulting. This video is different, and here's why. Every meal you're about to hear actually comes from your generation. These are dishes that were on real dinner tables in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, meals your family loved, meals you may not have thought about in years. And we're going to walk through each one step by step so you can make any of them tonight with a pound of ground beef and a few things you probably already have in your pantry. Ground beef is running close to $7 a pound right now, which is not cheap, but every single meal on this list stretches that 1 pound into 4 generous servings or more, which brings your cost per plate down to under $2 for a real homemade hot dinner. Let's start with the one that probably needs no introduction at all, classic American meatloaf. There was a time when nearly every family in this country had their own version of this recipe, handed down or clipped from a newspaper column or scribbled on an index card taped to the inside of a cabinet door. The famous advice columnist Ann Landers printed her meatloaf recipe in the 1970s, and people mailed it to their daughters, their neighbors, their church friends. It became one of the most shared recipes in American newspaper history. And the reason it spread so far is that it was almost impossible to mess up. Here's how simple this is. You take a pound of ground beef and put it in a big mixing bowl. Add about half a cup of breadcrumbs, 1 egg, a small onion chopped up fine, a splash of milk, and a little salt and pepper. Mix that with your hands until everything is blended. And don't overthink it because there's no wrong way to do this part. Shape it into a loaf on a baking pan or press it into a loaf pan, spread some ketchup across the top, and slide it into the oven at 350 degrees for about an hour. That's the whole recipe. 1 bowl, 1 pan, 1 hour, and your kitchen is going to smell the way it did 30 years ago. The leftover slices, by the way, make one of the best sandwiches you'll ever eat the next day, with a little mustard on soft white bread. The second meal goes by a different name depending on where you grew up. In the Midwest, they called it goulash. In New England, it was American chop suey. Some families just called it chili mac. But no matter what name you knew it by, it was the same comforting one-pot dinner that showed up on tables all across this country for decades, especially from the 1950s through the 1980s. The original Hungarian goulash is a slow-cooked beef stew loaded with paprika that takes hours to prepare, but when American families got hold of the idea, they turned it into something much faster and much simpler, using ingredients they always had on hand. The name stuck even though the dish barely resembles its European ancestor, and honestly, nobody ever complained about that. To make it, you brown a pound of ground beef in a large pot with some chopped onion and a clove, or 2 of garlic. Once the beef is cooked through, you add a can of diced tomatoes, a small can of tomato sauce, about 2 cups of water or beef broth, and a good pinch of salt, pepper, and Italian seasoning. Bring that to a boil, then pour in about 2 cups of dry elbow macaroni, right into the same pot. Give it a stir, put the lid on, and let it simmer on low for about 15 minutes until the pasta is tender and has soaked up most of the liquid. The macaroni cooks right in the sauce, so it absorbs all that flavor, which is why this always tasted better than regular pasta with meat sauce on top. 1 pot, about 30 minutes from start to finish, and barely anything to clean up afterward. The third meal on this list is one that practically defined weeknight cooking for an entire generation. Sloppy Joes became a fixture in American kitchens, starting in the 1940s. And by the 1960s and 70s, there was hardly a school cafeteria or church supper in the country that didn't serve them. The most popular origin story traces back to a cook named Joe at a small cafe in Sioux City, Iowa, sometime around 1930, who decided to stir tomato sauce into a loose meat sandwich. The result was messy and delicious, and people loved it so much that the name Sloppy Joe just became part of the American vocabulary. In 1969, Hunt's launched a canned sauce called Manwich that made the whole process even faster, and it became one of the top-selling grocery items in the country almost overnight. But the homemade version is barely any more work than opening a can, and it tastes noticeably better. Start by browning a pound of ground beef in a skillet with some diced onion. Once the meat is cooked, stir in about half a cup of ketchup, a tablespoon of mustard, a tablespoon of brown sugar, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, and a little salt and pepper. Let that simmer together for about 10 minutes, stirring it now and then, until it thickens into a rich, slightly sweet sauce that holds together on a bun without running everywhere. Spoon it onto soft hamburger buns, and that's dinner. The whole thing takes about 20 minutes and uses one skillet. Kids used to beg for this meal, and honestly, adults never got tired of it either because there's something about that combination of sweet, savory, and tangy that just works every single time. The fourth meal might bring back a memory you haven't thought about in a very long time. Porcupine meatballs were a staple of American home cooking in the 1950s and 1960s. And if you're under 40, you've probably never even heard of them. But if you were around back then, the name alone probably puts you right back in your mother's kitchen. They're called porcupine meatballs because raw rice is mixed right into the ground beef. And as the meatballs simmer in tomato sauce, the rice puffs up and pokes out through the surface like little quills. The recipe began during the Great Depression, when families figured out that mixing cheap rice directly into the meat was a way to stretch less beef into more meatballs. And the result tasted so good that it stayed on dinner tables for the next 3 decades. Here's how to make them. In a bowl, mix a pound of ground beef with half a cup of uncooked white rice, a small onion chopped fine, 1 egg, and some salt and pepper. Shape that mixture into meatballs about the size of a golf ball and place them in a pot or deep skillet. Pour 1 can of tomato sauce and about half a can of water over the top. Then bring it to a gentle simmer. Put the lid on and let them cook on low heat for about 45 minutes. The rice inside the meatballs cooks right in the sauce, so you don't need to make anything on the side unless you want to. That's the beauty of this recipe. The starch is already built into the meat, and the sauce ties everything together. Most of the cooking time is completely hands-off, so you can sit down and relax while the stove does the work. When you lift that lid and that tomato and beef smell fills your kitchen, you'll understand why people made this once a week for years. The fifth and final meal doesn't have a famous name or an origin story worth telling, and that's actually what makes it special. Beef and rice skillet was the kind of dinner that American families made on an ordinary weeknight without thinking of it as a recipe at all. It was just what you threw together when you had ground beef in the fridge and rice in the cabinet, and about 30 minutes before everyone needed to eat. This was everywhere in home kitchens from the 1960s through the 1980s, one of those meals that nobody wrote down because nobody needed to. You just knew how to make it the way you knew how to make your morning coffee. To make it, brown a pound of ground beef in a skillet with some diced onion. Once the meat is cooked, add 1 cup of uncooked white rice, 2 cups of beef broth or water, and a little salt and pepper. If you want to toss in a chopped bell pepper, a can of corn, or a handful of frozen peas, this is the time to do it. Stir everything together, bring it up to a simmer, then put a lid on the skillet and turn the heat down to low. Let it cook for about 20 minutes without lifting the lid so the steam can do its job. When you take the lid off, the rice will be fluffy and will have absorbed all the beefy, savory flavor from the broth and the meat. 1 skillet, 1 burner, 20 minutes of hands-off cooking, and you have a complete meal with protein, starch, and vegetables all in the same pan. Every single one of these meals has been feeding American families for generations, and none of them require any special skill, expensive ingredients, or hours of standing over a stove. They come from a time when cooking was just part of the day, not a hobby or a project, and the food that came out of those kitchens was honest and satisfying in a way that a lot of modern recipes try too hard to be. If any of these brought back a memory for you, or reminded you of something you haven't made in years, maybe tonight's a good night to pull out that skillet and make it again. You already know how.